Alright guys, let's go over what are the best Malignant hearts for Diablo 4 in Season 1. So, starting right off, I do have to mention that different classes can use different hearts, but there are some that are going to be that you can apply to all of the classes. So keep that in mind that this video will mainly focus in on the rogue, but you can still use this video as some of them, well, they're for multiple classes. Some of the hearts are great early game, but are terrible late game. And some of the ones, can be flip-flop depending on not only your build, or it technically depends on your rolls of gear. So again, some get better late game and some, are, great early game, and they can flip-flop. So I wanted to go ahead and kind of make sort of a tier list. And I say sort of because it will definitely change as you progress. And I know lots of people right now are not level 100, so I'm just going to be covering basically the early to mid game of this, because I think that there is definitely separation between the early and end game for how some of these hearts work. And I'm not going to be focusing in on the wrathful ones, as those ones are kind of only acquired towards late game. A lot of people just want to know, hey Slater, which ones are the best ones to equip? Honestly, the only really good one to have in particular for the rogue, because you can only view them on the rogue right here. In terms of all classes, Revenge is just straight up one of the best ones in the entire game. Why? Well, it gives you the ability to have just damage reduction. Now, on top of that, if you activate basically a defensive skill, or depending on the class you play, their categories in a certain category, you get to actually suppress the damage and have some sort of explosion. Now, all of the bonus damages that you get are actually pretty good in the early stages. I'm talking like level 10 and under. Some of these that give you some bonus damage, like a fire damage or a lightning or grenades come out, they're good for the early game. And in terms of scaling them in the late game, well, you might not be able to scale it, because if you guys have played towards the late stages of the game, you're noticing that you're going to get core skill damage. You're going to get damage to cutthroat or mastery skills, where you're not getting damage to like this exact thing, if that kind of makes any sense. So there is that other thing that you got to factor in. But let's go ahead and go over basically the best ones. Really what it comes down to is just Revenge. If you're looking for like what are the best ones, go ahead and sock it. Revenge is the only one that I can say that's just like so good, you always want to have this one. And the rest of them, it depends on the class that you're playing. And if you are playing the rogue, there is basically two S tier blue gems. I'm going to separate these in categories. So I'm going to talk about blue gems, then we're going to talk about orange, and then the pink gems. So starting right off in terms of the blue good gems. So I already mentioned Revenge. This is good on every single class. Now this one is only going to be for the rogue, and this one is called the Trickery. So the Trickery is one of the best ones in the entire game for rogue. So what does this one do? When you use a subterfuge skill, you throw a shadow clone, and that shadow clone will actually be a decoy. And that decoy will actually explode after a duration, and it'll basically one-shot most of the things in the earlier stages of the game. This is one of the best ones. It's actually pretty good towards the end game too, if you just want to activate it just so you can just aggro everything. I think it's a fantastic blue gem. Now there are going to be ones where they're good early game and they're like bad late game, but Revenge and Trickery are the two go-to for rogue. Absolutely double S tier gems on those ones. Like both of these are in the S tier category. Next up, in terms of the blue ones, we have Prudent. So what does Prudent do? This one I'll put in like the mid tier, so anywhere from like C tier is where I kind of put it. It gives you the ability to be immune. In earlier stages of the game, again, it's like in the C tier, it's kind of like okay, it gives you the ability to be immune after you take a bunch of damage from a single hit. That's 20% of your life. And the problem is it has a really long cooldown. However, for PvP, this one can actually be very good. So if you're looking at the end tier of the game, like if you're doing maybe some uber boss and there's a mechanic where if you don't, dodge it, you're going to lose like a lot of your HP. This one can actually be kind of good towards the end of the game. I'd say it's an A tier towards the end, but in the early stages, like a mid tier gem. It's like a C tier would be okay for this heart. And then in terms of, again, I'm covering this as the rogue, okay? The Lion Heart over here is the last blue gem in terms of the hearts. It's the blue one over here. This one is an F tier one for the rogue because you just simply don't have the barrier generation. Now I know there's one where you can chill and you can weave through, or maybe you get temerity, but for the most part, it's not going to be something that most people will actually kind of shoot for on the rogue because you just simply don't have access to it. If you do have an empty socket, always throw in any of the hearts, and the reason why is because it still applies armor. But to have the small amount of heal, if your character can somehow get barrier on rogue, I mean, again, there are some other ways to do it, but it's not really conventional for most builds. And again, temerity for the end game, it's not going to be super good. But there is like a midway progression where like if you are, pushing, and you don't happen to have good pants and you just happen to have temerity, then maybe you can make some use out of this. But for the most part, in the earlier stages, again, you're not going to be able to get temerity because you have to go to the higher world tiers because it is a unique item. It's pretty much an F tier gem for most rogue builds. But if there's some sort of niche thing towards the end, we'll talk about that in the future because I did want to actually make a build with it. But again, this is early to mid game, and I probably would not suggest running Lionheart. It's probably one of the worst ones to run because, well, you simply aren't going to be able to apply barrier on the rogue. If you're playing Sorceress, again, this video is from one of these 4 rogues. But next up, the orange ones. So which ones are the good orange ones? In the very beginning, I actually really like Cluster Munitions. I'd put it in the C tier still though, because it does require you to have a lucky hit, but it does launch a bunch of these stun grenades, and even though it's small damage, we're talking like, subpar, like, 10, level 10 and under, this thing is pretty good. It just deletes the small little enemies and also applies a stun. And if you, use it later in the game where you can make grenades count as trap skills, then we're talking about more theory crafting and builds. I would actually consider Cluster Munitions in the C tier category, but towards the end of the game, it could actually be pretty good, maybe in the B or even A tier for very specific niche build ideas with this thing. So yeah, it does apply a stun also, but it's for a very small amount, so you can't do like more damage against like stun targets, but it does apply the stun at least. So if you have some sort of condition where you get bonus damage to stun, it's only for 0.5 seconds though. So I would say in terms of the early stages, again, this is going to be easily a C tier gem. And then next up, in terms of the orange ones, the next one also I would consider it in terms of it being viable. It is absolute F tier 1 in the very earlier stages of the game. The earlier stages of the game, you're going to only have 5% crit strike chance, but your non-crits will deal a lot less damage. So your crits do more damage, but your non-crits deal less. So as long as you have like over 50% crit, or technically I think it's like 40-ish%, because the numerical numbers are still higher on the other end. As long as you have about 40-ish% crit, usually, and it depends on the rolls too that you get on this, because that has a range, but it's like double. So as long as you have about 40% crit towards the end of the game, which is very achievable, this is absolutely like an A or an S tier gem. This gem is amazing for damage. But again, earlier in the game, you're just not going to have enough crit, because if you have 5% crit chance, well, then you should just do basically like 40% less damage for the most part. So don't run this. This is an F tier gem in the very early stages, but again, this is like an A or S tier towards the very end of the game. And then the next orange one is called the Dark Dance. While you, every 5 seconds while above 60% life, your skills will cost X amount of life. Earlier on, well, you'll end up eliminating yourself. It's going to be very dangerous to run this early game, but in the late game, you can run builds that actually have a lot more sustain. We did lose Siphoning Strikes, which is major, because if Siphoning Strike was not nerfed, this would be an absolutely SS plus gem. It would be probably one of the godliest things in the entire game, no troll. But because of that change, the Dark Dance, unfortunately, is pretty bad early game. I would say it's like a C tier gem if you can, mark it in terms of the early game. Later though, I could say it being like a B tier or maybe an A tier gem if you actually can build around it, because there are some builds where you can actually get a bunch of healing, and therefore you're just using your HP as another resource pool, which is quite awesome. And they deal a massive amount of extra damage. Like, it's really good late game, but again, early to mid game, well, you just don't happen to have the amount of life to sustain it, to make it viable. And next up, the Bacana, your crit strikes will charge the enemy. There are certain things where you can get guaranteed crits, so you can activate this. Like, for example, with your concealment, whatever breaks, it can apply 100% crit, right? So with this, yeah, there is a little bit of play with this, because you can like activate it. It does a small amount of damage. It's really not that big of a deal, because you don't have that much crit early game. Kind of the same reason why the other one is greater towards the end of the game. Now, because you can still apply a hit, it can actually activate things like Inner Sight or other things that require X amount of hits to have something happen. It can actually be pretty good, because every class can use it. So I could say that this would be easily a B tier gem for some builds, and because it does like lightning damage, there's some that does like fire damage and stuff, you can't really scale it as well on Rogue. You can scale it maybe a little bit better on the Sorceress, because you get bonus to non-physical damage, but earlier game, it actually does, it's weird, because in the earlier game, if you just did like 20 damage, you can actually eliminate things quite fast if you just start critting, but like your crit chance is just simply too low to make it viable. I'd kind of skip out on this one. I'd say it's like a C tier gem, maybe if you have a niche build, maybe like a B tier gem in terms of the orange. Next up, and lastly, we have the pink, because I want to save the Wrathful for a separate video, as they are towards the end game anyways. So starting right off with Determination. Determination over here, it has the resource draining effects, well, with Rogue, which you don't have. I guess maybe with like resource burn, maybe it can proc with it, but we're talking early game. I would say this is not something that you really want. And then you have increased resource generation. So that part is actually not too bad for it, but most other builds, the pink category is not ideal earlier on. For the most part, there is one that I'll talk about that I think is actually pretty decent, but for the most part, in the pink category, there isn't anything super amazing. So this one, I'd say it's like a C tier, maybe even like D tier, because like the amount of regen that you get is very minor. And then next up, we have Retaliation over here. This one, when you break CC, you're able to actually do some damage. If again, you're very low level, then you can start one-shotting everything, and it can be kind of used, but for the most part, I would say that most people will kind of skip out on that one, just because it's not going to apply enough damage towards the later stages of the game. But again, earlier on, 20 fire damage can actually be pretty nice, but it depends, what level you are. If you're towards the middle of the game, it's not going to be super amazing. I'd put it in like the middle tier category. So like a C tier would be okay for retaliation. And again, since you don't have like plus bonus damage to fire, you're going to get core skills and cutthroat skills if you're playing like Twisting Blades. Next one up, in terms of the pink ones, we have the calculated. So this one over here, after spending a bunch of resource, you can actually stun. The rogue can actually spend resource quite fast. So applying that stun is actually not that bad towards the end of the game, but you're not going to be able to spend that much resource earlier on because you're not going to have any like some sort of like bounce for regen. So this one over here, where would I put it? I would put it in the earlier stages. I would say it's pretty bad. So like I would put it in like these like C or maybe D tier, so it's pretty low. But towards the end of the game, it can actually be pretty good, and I would say it's in the B tier. If you're playing Sorceress though, this one actually could be really good because you can activate this thing where it uses a bunch of your resource instantly, and you can get 200 of your mana on your Sorceress, and then everything just stuns and then applies your bonus damage from the aspect of control. So this one is a little better for some other classes, but it's still definitely not a bad one late game. It's just early game, you just can't spend that much mana like consistently and really fast, so you just have no way of upkeep. And then we have the clip shot. So the clip shot, I would say it's a B tier one, and the reason why and how it works is we have a lucky hit. We have a chance for our cutthroat skills to slow by 40% for 8 seconds. Well, again, some of these numerical things in like that 20 to 40%, and some of these can, roll. And then our marksman skills knock back. Knockback is actually pretty good, and the reason why I would consider this one a B tier one for the most part is because if we go to the skills over here, there is one where if we knock down or knock back, we can get increased critical strike chance up to like 12%. And so for that reason over there, I really think that that one is actually pretty dang good clip shot. And also if you want to get bonus damage to, again, slowed or crowd control targets, this one is actually pretty good for the earlier stages because you don't have that much control over your rolls in the very beginning because you're not going to sit there and go to the occultist and reroll everything in the earlier stages. So this just lets you apply it. And again, there's not really like a really insane pink one in the earlier stages of the game. So anyways, now that you guys have the info, that is my idea in terms of the tier list, in terms of all of the colors. So again, blue, you want Revenge, Trickery, and then for the orange ones, there's not really, again, one that's super good in the earlier stages of the game. And then for the pink ones, again, I actually really like the clip shot, but again, you have to have something that can benefit off of this, but getting any knockback is pretty good earlier on to get that crit. And then the other things can become more active. Again, the problem with the orange ones is like, well, you just don't happen to have crit in the earlier stages. So those are the good ones. Basically, all you really need is Revenge. The rest of them, Revenge and Trickery, are great for Rogue. The rest is kind of just like whatever for the most part until you get towards the end game, or if you have some sort of a niche sort of build. But we'll be covering the Wrathful ones, and I'll be making an updated end game one once we have, more info on some of these, as some of these are quite rare to get like the good rolls, and I want to test some of these out. Anyways, that's gonna wrap it up. If you guys enjoyed the video, drop a like on it. If you're new here and want to see that, hit subscribe, turn that bell, and that is the best hearts for the Rogue early to mid game. And I'll catch you guys in the next video. Peace out.